Get out of there. That's a little better one. That's a pretty fish right there. Turbo FattyZ. He was up there in that Kissimmee grass. And this time of year in Florida, a lot of these fish are thinking about spawning, have spawned. You know, they're getting ready to spawn, or they have spawned, or they're gonna spawn. And it's all a period of 3 months probably in Florida they spawn, but there's so much different vegetation in Florida. You see this Kissimmee grass here, this dead stuff that's laid over. The green stuff, you can see the tops of it been eaten off, but those are arrowheads. And both of those grow in pretty hard bottom a lot of times. So those fish will spawn around that. A lot of times you'll end up with hydrilla everywhere. But that and pencil reeds are really your 3 prime vegetations that fish spawn around. This time of year, they're generally somewhere around it. Now they may be on the backside on a bed, they may be out in front of it, but they're in that general vicinity because they're all around that spawning period. You know, they've just spawned, they're gonna spawn, or they are spawning. So, you know, those are the 3 things to really look for in Florida for vegetation, is that harder stuff. And sometimes there's so much Kissimmee grass, it's kind of like, where do you start in some of these lakes? But you go to some of those big places with a lot of it, and a lot of times it ends up being pads or reeds that are mixed in with it that those fish associate to. Florida's kind of a hard place to say where vegetation is going to be the best. I mean, I've caught them in hard bottom around hydrilla and holes. Isolated stuff is pretty hard to beat when they're spawning. If it's warm, I guess I say that even if it's colder, isolated mats are really good. A lot of times you're in an area, but the isolated stuff, it's a lot easier to target those fish. If you're in a field of pads, it's always the 4 pads that are sitting out to the side of them that you get a bite more consistently than you would in, you know, just fishing pads. Just generalities are pretty hard to accomplish success with when there's so much of it. It's overwhelming when you go to some of these lakes in Florida that are just flat and miles of vegetation, and those irregularities always important everywhere in the country, but probably even more so here. And the irregularities usually amount to isolation, just an isolated patch. What do I have? Oh, it's not even that big. I pinned to a tree. There it is. I was thinking that was a giant. I had it pinned to that bush, a couple pounder, but I'm sure he was probably up there spawning. A little hole on the inside of the grass. Those defined edges to the grass, when there's a hole in them and it's really defined, a lot of times that's where fish have been making beds. And I say fish because here there's tilapia, bluegill, and throughout the course of the year, a lot of times those fish will cycle through and use that same hole, and it just creates a spot that fish are always making a bed on, whatever species of fish it is. This style worm is really prominent in the southeast, but you know, it works everywhere. Around vegetation, it really shines though. It's just so versatile. You know, I can throw this worm out here, I can reel it on the surface, I can wake it, I can sit here and drop it in holes, I can drag it, cast it out in the grass and fish it on the bottom. You know, there's just so many different things you can do with it because of that tail. It catches enough water that you can do all those things. Still is action fishing it slow though. So it gives you a lot of options, especially when you're out hunting for fish. Florida is probably the hardest place to find them. You can go and a long ways and just go and go and go, and you're covering a lot of water trying to find little areas that have fish. You go to a place like Okeechobee and there's just miles of grass out there. You know, when I'm in a situation like that, you're winding it on top or just below the surface. You want to get that first bite to figure out how many are really there, and this worm really excels for that. And it's also good to slow down with it too. It just gets a lot of bites in a lot of different ways. Jeez, that's a fast one. That's too fun right there. That is too fun. You can see that straight shank hook with that steeper point out coming through that plastic. It really just, it starts so much sooner than an EWG that gets to the outside. And people call it transfer down here a lot. If I get this fish unhooked, I'll show you what transfer is. And man. But a lot of times when it's in a fish like that, they call it transfer because what happens is all this vegetation slides down your line and gets into your hook. And it's so much worse when you hook a fish outside of the, or towards the outside of the mouth, inside the mouth still, but out towards the mouth of the entrance of the fish's mouth. It's so much worse just because you get so much more vegetation on your hook, and it ends up almost unhooking the fish. It's something that is really challenging, and hooking them deeper in the mouth is really important. And a straight shank or some with a steep point angle like that really helps with that also. Kissimmee grass grows in lines a lot, but I don't necessarily know why it is. You always assume there's a bottom composition change, but there's some places Kissimmee grass, well, you see it growing all the way up on the bank, and I've seen it grow out of 8-9 feet of water before. Super deep Kissimmee grass. I don't really know why it grows in lines like that. Those arrowheads, they're pretty hard to beat when they're spawning. They're hard to find ones with enough depth on them, but arrowheads always grow in a really hard bottom. If you go up there and stick your tip in the water next to an arrowhead, it's always crunchy with rocks and shells and whatever's down there. It's hard. But again, it's the kind of deal that finding some with enough depth is a lot of times a problem. Getting kind of close. In Florida, you're way better to be a lot further away. You catch some close, but it seems like generally they know you're there pretty early compared to other places in the country. I don't know if it's just because they live in shallower water or what, but Florida fish are more aware of the boat than a lot of places for some reason. Yeah, long casts are important. I mean, in certain situations, sometimes you don't have the ability. You're throwing to holes and targets and that kind of stuff. Your accuracy goes down the further you are, but if you get out in those fields of stuff or hydrilla, anything like that, longer casts are really important anytime you're in skinny water, but especially in Florida. That being said, we'll catch them out of mats, you know, with an 1.5 ounce weight right next to you, but I think those fish still know you're there. If there's not a mat, you'll see fish as far as you can possibly see already coming to check out the boat or going away from it. They're just very aware of it, and the more aware they are, the less likely they are to be outsmarted by a bait.